Hey everybody, I'm here today with my thoughts on Star Trek Starfleet Academy. The new show dropped yesterday with its first two episodes. I've only watched the first one, so this video is going to focus on that. I'll do another video when I get around to watching the next episode, probably watch that tonight. Overall, I'd say the show is fine. It's not the best of Star Trek, but it's certainly not the worst of Star Trek. I'm about 50-50 with stuff that I enjoyed versus stuff that I thought maybe wasn't so great. For those who don't know, it's, a show that is centered around Starfleet Academy and a group of cadets. Takes place about 900 years, I believe I was seeing, from kind of the timeline that most people have interacted with, which is, your Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager. It's kind of 900 years from kind of that point in the timeline. After an event that was introduced in Discovery called the Burn, where basically everything's been decimated and we're in a rebuilding phase for Starfleet. And this is the first class since the Burn. Now, I like this part. This was an element I liked because one thing I bristled with in a lot of, kind of modern Star Trek is that kind of loss of that optimism. There's a lot of presenting Starfleet as not necessarily, always on the up and up. And, this is something that's been explored in the past. Obviously, Undiscovered Country, dealt with that quite a bit with the, conspiracy to assassinate the, president of the Federation. And then you get into, a lot of the stuff in Deep Space Nine, especially when you start getting into, kind of the more underbelly of Starfleet, the kind of black ops doing the dirty work kind of stuff. And that was always enjoyable. I love Deep Space Nine, so I'm not opposed to that, but I feel like it's always been handled very ham-fistedly with the people who've been in charge of Star Trek as of late. However, I do think this is a great time for him to be able to explore that because we're now dealing with a Starfleet that has been decimated and they're rebuilding and they kind of have to do unsavory things and, have to justify it. And you see that in the first 10 minutes where in the past, in the more kind of optimistic, altruistic presentation of Starfleet, Caleb's mother would have, been maybe slapped on the wrist or something like that. She's instead separated from her child and sent to a penal colony. So, from that jumping off point, we're shown that Starfleet is acting in a way that we're not necessarily used to. Or, maybe we haven't enjoyed that kind of presentation in the past because it didn't really gel. But here it actually kind of works because of the jump in timeline and the circumstances around what's going on in the universe in this time frame. So this is a great timeline and series to be able to really explore that. So I do like that part of it. Now, I do find the characters are pretty good, but I think that on surface, as much as, I do tend to like the characters, I feel like they're really undercut by some of the writing. And that's one of the things that I definitely take issue with. I am not one to clutch my pearls at, swearing or things like that, but, I do bristle at the sort of, kind of boomery, hello there, fellow kids, look how edgy I am, I'm doing a swear kind of writing that's in here with that kind of stuff. Like, it just kind of feels forced. A lot of the performances are fine, but some of them do feel a little kind of little Disney Channel teen show level of acting. And, I would hesitate to blame the actors so much on that as more of a choice of kind of what the target audience is. The writing feels very YA, like they're really trying to get the romantasy book talk people on board with Star Trek. we'll see how that plays out in the future as episodes unfold as to how that actually ends up working out in its favor, or, ending up, kneecapping the series before it can even get its legs under it and get going. But that said, I do overall like the characters that they've presented us with. I think that Holly Hunter's, Chancellor of the Academy, Nala Ake, I think is a great little character. I think that, when she's in her role as captain of the Athena, I feel like she has a level of swagger that has sorely been missed from some of the captains that we've had in recent years, who've generally kind of been, super serious. I think that she has a little bit of that Kirk swagger, but it's her own. It's not like she's, trying to ape what Shatner did. She is making that swagger her own. And you see that in her kind of interplay with Paul Giamatti, and his character Nuss Braca, especially when you get to kind of towards the climax of the show, the way that those two play off each other. There's some great stuff in there. I think the students are, all fine. I was worried that Caleb was going to be one of these characters that's just patently unlikable, and you're supposed to just feel, sympathetic for him because of the inciting incident that starts the show with him being separated from his mom, but otherwise he's just an unlikable character. You're just supposed to feel sorry for him because something happened to him. And I was, pleasantly surprised that that is not the way they're going. We're given more of his personality pretty much once he gets into the academy. I love the Klingon character. I think the character of Jaden Cragg, I think is actually really great because, when you look at like the way that the Klingons were kind of presented in Discovery, I didn't really care for that. Obviously, the redesign was terrible. But, I think there's interesting things that you can do with Klingon culture that, I think that this character, this Klingon who is essentially a pacifist, he likes watching birds. He wants to be a doctor. He is a total pacifist. He's not into the warrior thing. And I really like that. I think that's an interesting thing to explore with a Klingon. So I really enjoyed, his character. I think the character of Sam, the hologram student, is just kind of nice, light character. Obviously there for some, levity and comedic relief. Now, they gotta walk a fine line with her because that can tip over into, becoming obnoxious and a little too much. So they do need to walk a fine line, but I do think that the interactions between her and Robert Picardo's doctor is going to be very, very fun overall, and I think going to be a great, kind of dynamic there. The only character whose introduction really bothered me was Darren Ramey, who really is introduced in the most stereotypical high school bully kind of scene, and it really just kind of pulled me out of the show because it was done literally in the most stereotypical way. He bumps into Jaden Cragg. His binoculars fall out of his bag, and he grabs them and is doing the keep away thing. And then Caleb comes in and they get into a little bit of a tussle. It's like straight out of every single, stereotypical junior high school show or movie, and it pulled me out. Thankfully they don't, they come back to it once or twice. This kind of, antagonistic dynamic between him and Caleb. But you get a lot more of him outside of that bully dynamic pretty quickly. And, I hope they kind of pull back and kind of take that part out pretty quickly, because that was definitely one of the weaker points in the show. You know, like I said, it just kind of pulled me right out. Now, obviously, you know, your standouts there are going to be, you know, Robert Picardo as the Doctor. You know, he's always great. It's always great to see a character like that come back. And Paul Giamatti's, you know, villain, Nus Braca, I really enjoyed. Um, you know, he's, you know, definitely a gray character. He's, you know, very villainous, but at the same time, he tends to have, and it's, you know, kind of alluded to in the very beginning of the show, that, you know, his motivations may be to an extent honorable, but it's his execution that is not. So, you know, there's some interesting stuff that's probably going to go on there, and, you know, very much enjoy that. So looking forward to seeing how he comes in and out of the show as the story needs it. The designs are good. You know, I really like the design of the interior of the Athena, but yeah, I'm still wrestling a little bit with the design of the exterior of the ship, with the warp engines that are look to be held like magnetically in place, and then when it goes down to land on a planet, the, you know, the engines kind of move out and dock, and then the main ship heads down. I don't know what I think fully of that. I mean, it's going to take me a bit to warm up to that design scheme, because it just, like, it's not clicking with me as of yet for the exterior. Like I said, the interior of the ship is amazing. I think that the interior set for that ship is so well designed, and it looks so good. It's just nice and clean. Like, I really enjoy that. You know, the humor, I think, for the most part, landed pretty well. But again, you know, this is something where there's a lot of it throughout the show. It's at least spaced out fairly well. The character of Laura Thok gets a lot of the jokes in this episode. So in that, you kind of have two characters that are fairly comic reliefy with Sam and Laura Thok. So again, you're walking a very fine line, and sometimes it walks right up to that line and starts to teeter over a little bit, where you have serious situations going on and humor is kind of undercutting that. So, you know, they need to really watch that. But again, like I said, you know, when talking about the characters, you know, I feel like they have some really good characters, but they are undercut by some really iffy dialogue. And some very kind of Disney Channel-esque performances. And that's going to really, you know, potentially hurt the show in the long run if they can't kind of tighten that up. You know, again, tonally, while I do think that exploring the underbelly of Starfleet in this timeline is a good fit, you know, there is still, you know, I'm not feeling that same kind of optimism of the original series or Next Generation that, you know, is so key to Star Trek. You know, so I'm not really feeling that yet. We'll see where it goes. But all in all, you know, I would say that it was fine. Like I said, if I had to give it a star rating, I'd give it a 2.5 out of 5. You know, just kind of middle of the road. Like I said, you know, and I know just from my own looking to see kind of what people were saying about it after I'd watched it. You know, YouTube right now is full of video after video after video. It's, you know, woke trash. It's this, it's that, it's the worst thing ever. I would, I mean, you know, I'm not going to go so far as to say it's the worst thing ever, or, you know, to say that it's the greatest Star Trek since Wrath of Khan. Not at all. It's fine, you know. As far as intro episodes of a Star Trek show, which are notoriously hit and miss, you know, it's fine. It's fine. You know, it's perfectly enjoyable. Like, you can watch it and get enjoyment out of it, but, you know, go in with expectations that, you know, this is in line with the kind of modern era of Star Trek. You're not going to go in there and get something akin to, TNG or Deep Space Nine, or even something like Enterprise, which was a very flawed show for that era, but still kept a lot of the hallmarks that kept, Trek fans coming back to it, even though unfortunately it didn't last very long, but has aged it well over time. So you're getting exactly kind of what you're thinking. This is very in line with, especially Discovery, because Discovery's events really play more into the lead up to this show than, say, Strange New Worlds or Lower Decks or any of those. So I would definitely recommend checking it out if you're a Star Trek fan. But just level set those expectations. You're going to have some iffy dialogue. You're going to have some, boomery, hey there, fellow kids dialogue that is going to be cringy. I mean, not to get too spoilery, but there is a line of dialogue that is right up there on the cringe factor of, I'm the juggernaut, bitch. I mean, there is some dialogue that is that bad, and you'll know it when you run into it. But I think it has potential to grow. I think it has potential to refine itself and get maybe to that place of being a truly good or even great, Star Trek show. Do I have faith that it's going to get there? Probably not, because again, this is a Kurtzman joint, and JJ's boys suck. I'm sorry, they just do. You already have them falling into mystery box stuff with Caleb's mom. Where is she? What happened to her? We're gonna find out. We're gonna go looking for her. So we're already falling into those traps and those pitfalls around mystery box nonsense. So that could hurt the show in the long run. So I don't necessarily have faith that they're going to get it to that level. Now, could it be fully just, enjoyable popcorn, just TV, in the background, and get your enjoyment out of it for what it is? Sure. But they have a pretty big mountain to climb to get it to good to great, and we'll see if they pull it off. But right now, very middle of the road. Very middle of the road. Good stuff, bad stuff basically kind of equals out. So we'll see. If you watched it, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.